Hello and welcome to another episode of the Dongfang Hour China Aerospace and Space News Roundup. This for the week of the 21st to 27th of June, 2021. I'm Blaine Curcio, joined as always by my co-host, Jean Deville. Before getting into this week's news updates, a special shout out to our good friends at Go Taikonauts and Spacewatch.global, two excellent sources of space industry news. On the topic of space industry news, as you may notice, there is a lot of it coming from China. This week, as we do every week, we will cover the several major news updates from the Chinese space sector. But if you're interested in more insights and more news, I encourage you to check out the Dongfang Hour China Aerospace and Space Newsletter, which includes between 10 and 12 updates every week. This week in the podcast, we have several major updates, including a massive investment fund being raised by a company down in Shenzhen, some assorted updates on China's answer to Starlink, namely the China SatNet constellation. But first, Jean will give us a breakdown of some tidbits of information released on China's super heavy lift rocket, the Long March 9, and some other variants. And a gentle suggestion for viewers to stay until the end of this episode, at which time Jean will have a small quiz question and some assorted other updates. That being said, this is the Dongfang Hour.
Ladies and gentlemen, we are honored to welcome you aboard the Dongfang Hour. Please make sure your seatbelt is securely fastened. Thank you.
女士们、先生们，预计空中飞行时间2小时15分钟，我们预计在当地时间下午6点25分左右到达。
And Jean, what's going on this week in Hong Kong?
Yes, massive update this week about launch. And this is in the context of a lot of high-ranking Chinese space scientists visiting Hong Kong and giving speeches. And all the craze this week was about one speech in particular, and that was the presentation of Lehao. And so let's talk about that. Lehao is the head engineer of the Long March rockets at the Chinese Academy of Launch Technology. He's a guy who's 83 years old, by the way. And he gave a much-awaited presentation at the University of Hong Kong on June the 24th. And Lehao's presentations are always followed very closely by space fans because they are an excellent way to get some juicy little details on the upcoming Long March rockets. And this has already been the case, for example, when he gave a speech on the Long March 9 in May 2018, and that was at Tsinghua University. A lot of good details on the Long March 9 configuration. And boy, this time, again, did he not disappoint. So the presentation he gave some interesting and new information on China's lunar rockets. And the funny thing was his presentation wasn't really focusing on these lunar rockets at all. It was a broad coverage of Chinese launch and just space history. And there was maybe one or two slides that was on the Long March 9 and the other lunar rocket. But that was what focused all of the attention. So let's take things in the order and break them down. So let's start with the Long March 9. The Long March 9 is China's hypothetical super heavy rocket, which has been in discussion in the country as early as 2010. So it's been more than 10 years. And historically, it's been known as China's Saturn V or China's SLS, whatever you want to call it, with the objective of putting very significant payload, including crew, into translunar injection. The Long March 9 has changed many times. It has changed in terms of propulsion technology, in terms of the architecture and the number of stages of parts. And again, with Lehao's presentation a couple of days ago, we have yet another massive iteration. And so, as you can see on the only slide that was linked to the Long March 9 architecture of Lehao's presentation, you can see that, first of all, the latest version of the Long March 9 that was known up to a couple of days ago was the one that you can see on the left of the slide. It's the version that was shown to Xi Jinping at the Great Hall of the People in February 2021, which is something that we covered back in the day. And this Long March 9, so the old version of Long March 9, is a 3-version configuration that Lehao calls the 11 edition, the Xiban, meaning basically the edition that was probably first proposed in 2011. And in this well-known configuration, basically you have 3 versions. You have the Long March 9, the heaviest version. It's a 3-stage rocket with 4 strap-on boosters. And it's a huge rocket capable of putting 140 tons into LEO, making it comparable to NASA's SLS. You have the core stage and the strap-on boosters that use the sophisticated YF-130 Kerolox closed-cycle twin-nozzle engine, while the second stage uses the 2 YF-90 Hydrolox engines, each providing a massive thrust of 220 tons. The third stage uses four new generation YF-79 25-ton thrust Hydrolox engines. And it's notable that this rocket, this previous Long March 9, while using what we can call probably a classical architecture, is actually also using engines that are all newly developed engines. Like none of these engines that I've just mentioned are used in previous versions of Long March rockets. And this is why the development timeline of the Long March 9 extends all the way up to the end of the 2020s, early 2030s, because everything is new. Things are done from scratch. The other two versions of the Long March 9 is the 9A, which is a lighter version of the Long March 9, and which only has 2 strap-on boosters instead of 4. And that makes the payload from Lehao drop from 140 tons to 100 tons. And then you have the lightest version, the Long March 9B. It has no strap-on boosters, although that is not the only difference, but it's the most visible difference. And the payload drops from 100 tons to only 50 tons, although only probably is not the right word. And so, yeah, that was the previous version of the Long March 9. And the most recent edition, things change completely. And this is what you see on the right side of the slide. It's dubbed the 21 edition, the Ershi Ban. So probably meaning that, the edition from 2021. And it seems that CALT really started from a clean slate because literally everything has changed. You have only one unique super heavy version of the Long March 9 now. And Lehao says that this is because there will be other operational rockets that will cover for the payload capacity that provided initially the lighter versions of the Long March 9. And this will notably be the 921 rocket that I'll mention in a couple of minutes. And so this new generation super heavy Long March 9 has a payload capacity of 150 tons to Lehao. And basically that makes it similar, maybe 10 tons more, but makes it very similar to the previous Long March 9. This rocket very noticeably has no strap-on boosters, and it's available in a 2-stage version for Lehao and a 3-stage version for all the other orbits. And this reminds us a little bit of the logic that was already present with the Long March 5. You had the Long March 5 with 3 stages, basically, and you have the Long March 5B, which only has 2 stages, and that's destined to Lehao. And now one question that everyone probably has asked themselves is that how can this rocket, new version of the Long March 9, provide the same payload capacity while at the same time having no strap-on boosters, as compared to the previous version? And this is because it's because of this new design. Basically, first of all, the first stage has a huge number of engines. You can see on this slide that the first stage is equipped with 16 YF-135 engines, and clustering so many engines on the first stage is really an unprecedented architecture for China. It's never been used before in the country, and it does have some resemblance with, for example, SpaceX's, Starship's super heavy. So the first stage of a Starship, which houses 30 or so Raptor engines, also has some resemblance with the M1, which the Soviet Lunar rocket, which also clustered a lot of engines on the first stage. And the idea here is probably that this architecture makes the Long March 9 much easier to reuse, because when you have a lot of engines, then you don't have to throttle the engines that are involved in the vertical landing as much. And so, yeah, and definitely CALT is going towards this reusable rocket route. So it does make sense. Another reason why this new version of the Long March 9 is able to provide the same amount of payload capacity while being, with no strap-on boosters, it's because it's very simply, it's just a larger rocket. The rocket has a diameter of 10.8 meters as opposed to 9.5 for the previous Long March 9. The rocket is also taller, 108 meters as opposed to 103 for the old version. And ultimately, when you look at this PPT, you realize that the new version of the Long March 9 uses common bulkhead tanks, which can fit more propellant for a given rocket volume as opposed to the more traditional tanks that were used on the previous Long March 9. So all of these reasons that make the Long March 9 as powerful, the new one, as the previous one. Now let's talk about the second rocket, which is what was previously called the 921 rocket, or China's Falcon Heavy, or it was also called the next generation crewed rocket of China. So there was a lot of different names. And again, in this PPT, we have a new name for it. So that's just how Chinese space works. And so this rocket was first mentioned by the Chinese in 2018. It was sold to the public as a faster way for China to get access to a crewed lunar rocket. And this shorter time frame was enabled by the fact that this rocket would be using already operational pieces of space, space equipment, proven technology. And so this rocket now is called the Long March 5 DY. And honestly, I think this name makes a lot more sense than all the names mentioned previously. Long March 5 does suggest that it's based on previous technology because Long March 5 is already an existing rocket. And DY means 登月 in Chinese. So 登月 meaning reaching the moon. And so Long March 5 DY means the Long March 5 lunar rocket. And so this rocket is a 3-stage rocket. As mentioned, it uses existing technology, notably for the engines. The core stage and the boosters will use the YF-100K, which is the latest iteration of the YF-100 Kerolox engine that is used in the Long March 5 and Long March 6 and 7 and 8. We have also for the second stage, the YF-100 series vacuum optimized engines. So they'll be using the latest iteration, which is the YF-100M. And for the upper stage of this Long March 5 DY, the Chinese will be using the good old YF-75D, which is quite an old engine. It's an iteration of an engine, the YF-75, a hydrolox engine that was used as early as I think in the 1980s. Back in the day where China was developing the Long March 3, which was the first Chinese rocket with geostationary capability. So yeah, the Long March 5 DY will be able to put taikonauts to the moon in 2 separate launches. As we can see on the presentation here, basically you'd have a first rocket that would first send the crewed vehicle, and you'd have a second launch of the Long March 5 DY, which would launch the transfer and the lander modules, and these different modules apparently would dock together in lunar orbit. There isn't actually anything new about this configuration or this strategy. This is more or less what was suggested in previous presentations. There isn't that big of a scoop in Lehao's presentation for the Long March 5 DY other than the new name. However, there's one point that was interesting in the presentation is that you see on the right of the presentation this shortened version of the rocket without the upper stage and without the strap-on boosters. And so Lehao mentions that this version will be used for crewed missions into Lehao. So you'll have this shortened version of the Long March 5 DY, and presumably it will be sending the next generation crewed vehicle made by China into orbit. And this is probably because the current crewed rocket of China, the Long March 2F, which is, as mentioned in the past episode, this is very old technology. It is not able to put such a large payload, the next generation crewed vehicle, into low Earth orbit. Last thing I think that's worth mentioning here maybe is that Lehao's presentation mentions that the first crewed missions to the moon from China will take place before 2030. And that is interesting, that is ambitious, but probably the most noteworthy part of this announcement is that it's a little bit in contradiction with the presentation that was made about the ILRS about a week ago, where they mentioned that crewed lunar missions will only intervene in the 3rd stage of the ILRS called the utilization phase. And so that's after 2035, as opposed to what we're seeing here on the presentation before 2030. So that's a bit contradictory, but maybe this is because these first lunar crewed missions before 2030 will not be in the context of the ILRS. I don't know, but I think that's just something to note. And so that's my wrap up for Lehao's speech. A lot of interesting stuff. The presentation that lasts 2 hours. So if you understand some Mandarin, it's definitely worth giving it a watch. And so, Blaine, any thoughts on this presentation?
For sure. And thanks to the good folks at HKU, that video is available pretty conveniently on YouTube, I think. So just a couple of very small points to unpack on your analysis. Then I will dive in a little bit more to the sort of Hong Kong angle here. So my first thought about Lehao talking about 2030 is that it's entirely possible that at age 83, he's just a man in a hurry to some extent. So you'd have to give him some credit there, and you have to respect that. He wants to see this happen soon because, for him, soon is important. Other point that I would mention, so the difference that you described between the new generation Long March 9 and the previous Long March 9, that 150 tons compared to 140, point taken that it is a relatively small increase, and that it's basically quite similar, but it's just amazing to think the additional 10 tons represents about half of the payload of a Long March 5. And in a similar vein, to think that the Long March 9 would be, about 6 times, the Long March 5's payload capacity. So quite a massive rocket. And at 108 meters tall, I was just trying to visualize how many people that would be standing on top of one another. And I got to a number of about 60 or 70 people. So definitely very big rocket, a lot of interesting updates there. So now just to dive in a little bit more on Hong Kong's role in China's space sector. So as Jean mentioned, the speech by Lehao and others, they were at HKU earlier this week. And in addition to the multiple speeches that we saw at HKU, we also saw an event at the Polytechnic University of Hong Kong, also known as PolyU here. And this featured Zhang He, the executive director of the Chang'e 4 lunar probe, and also Xie Jun, the deputy chief designer of the Beidou SatNet constellation. And so basically we had a bit of a space week here in Hong Kong last week. We also saw the PolyU administration welcome the Chinese space industry representatives, including some of the HKU speakers. I saw Lehao in the photo with PolyU's, I suppose, president. And we also saw this sort of space industry delegation go and visit the chief executive of Hong Kong, Carrie Lam, so sort of the equivalent of a prime minister, let's say. And so this is taking place as Hong Kong is starting to put more emphasis on trying to develop a space sector, and that is admittedly from a very low starting point. So up to now, the only real space sector in Hong Kong, so to speak, would be the several different satellite operators that are headquartered here, and formerly and possibly still currently one satellite service provider. So really not a whole lot as a starting point. And just to take an example of one of the ways in which the sort of Hong Kong government and its universities are trying to develop the space economy, I think this event took place at an interesting time at HKU in the sense that HKU, starting in the fall, is going to be offering a Master's of Science in Space Science course. So again, certainly a trend here in Hong Kong that space is of interest. Separately, we've also seen a few vaguely commercial space projects popping up in Hong Kong. So notably, there's a company called HKATG, which may or may not stand for Hong Kong Air to Ground. And they plan to launch the Golden Bohemia constellation of LEO satellites to provide coverage in the Greater Bay Area, which is Hong Kong, Macau, and some neighboring parts of Guangdong province. So again, starting to see a bit of a space sector building up in Hong Kong, starting to see a little bit more excitement here. That being said, being a very small place with very little advanced manufacturing and very expensive real estate, Hong Kong is not really a natural space industry hub. But it does have a well-educated workforce, a lot of engineers, a lot of capital to put into risky ventures like space. And I would also point out that Hong Kong stands at a quite interesting position relative to the Chinese space ecosystem as the Chinese space ecosystem is expanding very quickly. And that is to say, Hong Kong is... Again, it has a very sort of it has a Western legal system. It has sort of different capital structure from China as it relates to things like capital controls. There are certain intellectual property advantages of Hong Kong if you're a Western company relative to mainland China. And so when we think about all these things, and then we look at things like Guangzhou and Shenzhen, which are just over the border, starting to do a lot more in space, you could imagine there being some opportunity for Hong Kong to take advantage of the sort of interesting position that it finds itself in relative to the Chinese space sector, which again is growing by leaps and bounds as we find. So again, we are very far away from Hong Kong being a regional space industry hub. But in theory, we may have some of the ingredients needed to bring more space activity to the fragrant harbor. And even if not, that was a heck of a week last week in the Hong Kong space sector. We definitely saw some really amazing things. So, Jean, anything else on your side from Hong Kong, or shall we move into some updates on SatNet?
Let's move into SatNet.
Sounds good. So June 22nd of this week, we saw China SatNet and the city of Chongqing sign a cooperation agreement whereby China SatNet will try to leverage some existing satellite industry infrastructure in Chongqing, likely referring to Hongyan and related projects. So just a quick reminder, as we've mentioned in previous episodes, China SatNet is the operating company most probably for China's Guowang constellation, which is basically China's answer to Starlink to a certain extent. And so for SatNet to have gone to Chongqing and signed this agreement, it's quite significant. So Chongqing was, and in theory still is, the main focus city for CASC's low Earth orbit broadband constellation project, Hongyan. And so this has involved significant investment by CASC, likely into things like factories for satellites and different R&D for low Earth orbit applications, this type of thing. And admittedly, CASC has been quite a bit less public than CASIC about these efforts. So CASIC in Wuhan, they have their Wuhan National Aerospace Industry Industrial Base, and they have been providing pretty much weekly updates on the status of their satellite factory in Wuhan. And with CASC, we just know that they are building satellite-related infrastructure in places like Chongqing and Tianjin. So again, we have somewhat less understanding of what is going on in Chongqing in the context of CASC, but the implication is China SatNet will likely use some of the infrastructure developed by CASC in Chongqing as it, as it deepens its collaboration, let's say, with the city of Chongqing. So, getting a little bit more into this specific part of Chongqing and sort of what else is going on there. So the agreement, it refers to the Liangjiang New Area, which is a national level new area in Chongqing, and new area being basically a part of a city that can have some preferential tax incentives or some other kind of different governmental structure that can attract companies in specific industries. And we've already seen in Liangjiang, OneSpace, the commercial launch company, building its rocket factories there. And indeed, the company names its rockets Liangjiang Hao, like the Liangjiang series of rockets, as an homage to the city. And as we discussed in the Dongfang episode, Dongfang Hour episode 32, we did a somewhat deeper dive into Liangjiang. So if you're interested in more about Liangjiang, I encourage you to check that out. And so getting back to SatNet and their meeting in Chongqing, the sort of more interesting element is that this is the second time that the SatNet leadership has come to Chongqing, and being mindful that the company was only started about 8 weeks ago, having 2 trips to Chongqing to meet with their leadership is quite significant. And so it seems to involve it implies some promising LEO activity that is going to be happening in Chongqing related to China SatNet. Another point that I would mention about this meeting is that the Communist Party secretary of Chongqing, Chen Min'er, was present at both the meeting in May and also the meeting in June. Now, Chen is a longtime associate of President Xi Jinping, having worked under Xi as the vice governor, of Zhejiang province during the 2000s, while Xi was provincial party secretary. Chen is also a member of the 25-member Politburo, making him one of the most powerful politicians in China. And we've even seen a handful of years ago, foreign media, such as The Diplomat, was speculating that it's possible that Chen Min'er one day could emerge as a potential successor to Xi. And so all this is to say, Chen has a fair amount of political power, and Chongqing has significant financial resources that it may be able to pour into a LEO broadband constellation if there are sufficient incentives in place. Just the last point is about the Chongqing leadership. So the close relationship between the Chongqing leadership and Chen Min'er may be something to keep an eye on, as it indicates that China's major constellation has a very close relationship with a significant source of power. So again, Chen, it's not entirely clear how much influence he does wield in Beijing, but we do know that he and Xi Jinping go back a very, very long time, and that they have been associates for 20 years, let's say. So I guess moving forward, it's definitely going to be interesting to see where will be the next places that China's SatNet leadership goes to sort of kiss the rings of the existing infrastructure. And so again, with Chongqing, it's likely that this was the first place they went, because this was the place where CASC's constellation effort was concentrated. And moving forward, I would expect Wuhan, as I mentioned earlier. CASIC has a significant satellite factory in Wuhan. We also may see places like Shanghai, where we have the Chinese Academy of Sciences Shanghai Engineering Center for microsatellites, where they have built up a very large satellite factory and R&D center over in the Lingang Free Trade Zone. So again, not wanting to speculate too much, I suspect that the leadership of SatNet is going to be going to some of these different places where there is existing infrastructure for low Earth orbit broadband constellations, and kind of just sussing out the leadership and seeing what they can do. So that is all I have on Chongqing, but there is another update on China SatNet that I will go into, and then I will hand it back over to John. So later on in the week, we saw an interview with Bian Yongzu about SatNet. And so Bian is a researcher at the Center for International Security and Strategy of Tsinghua University, the Tsinghua Dashui Zhanlui Yuanquan Yanjiu Zhongxin. It's a research center affiliated with one of China's top universities. So Tsinghua is arguably the number one, if not number one, number two university in China. And so a few takeaways from Bian's discussion on SatNet. So the first thing that Bian noted is that the, quote, market mechanism of China's satellite industry is improving. In the past, the space field was basically dominated by SOEs. Now, private space has entered the stage of rapid development, and it is expected to flourish. So this is a really interesting shout out to commercial space companies in China, because honestly, as recently as 3 or 4 years ago, it would have been unimaginable for somebody from such a high level and sort of official research center to be singing the praises of the commercial space sector while talking about how it is undesirable for the SOEs to be controlling the sector. So first point, big shout out to the commercial space sector. The second point is that the interviewer asked Bien about Starlink specifically and how the rapid rollout has impacted China and its space sector. And to this point, Bien noted that Starlink's acceleration is very impressive and that if China wants to continue maintaining a lead in terms of next generation network technology, they must launch their own Starlink project because future networks will truly require connectivity everywhere, and you need a constellation to do that. Bien also made the point that after China became what he referred to as a world leader in 5G communication technology, the U.S. followed up by, quote, suppressing China's companies, especially international companies such as Huawei and ZTE. And I think implicitly it just sounds like Bien is saying, we need to rely on ourselves. We need to do our own constellation, and we need to maintain this lead in networks, let's say. So the third point would be the in regards to the Belt and Road Initiative and international aspirations of Starlink. So Bien pointed out that there's an increasing amount of trade between China and Europe. He specifically referred to the China-Europe rail line, which has been built over the last several years. And it seems like every week now, or at least pre-COVID, we would see, there's a new train going from Wuxi to Duisburg every 2 weeks or something. And so the idea being, if there's going to be this increased commerce between these two places or, along this line, if you want to have, say, live tracking of your goods or some, data being collected from the containers as they're being shipped, you'd need, again, like a global satellite internet network. So the last point about this interview, and then I'll hand it back over to Jean. So Bien noted that according to some reports, Starlink has reached 500,000 users and an annual revenue rate of $800 million. And both of these figures do seem pretty unlikely. I did see the other day that Elon Musk tweeted that Starlink had surpassed the very important number of 69,420 users. So 500,000 seems less likely, and 800 million in revenues, which would make Starlink one of the largest satellite operators in the world today, also does seem rather unlikely. But I guess the bigger point being here, Bien making having no ambiguity about the significance of Starlink, about the speed with which Starlink has been deployed, and for the need for China to do something about it to the extent of launching their own competitor to Starlink. So, Jean, I just had quite a mouthful there about SatNet. So, anything to add from your side on the China's answer to Starlink?
Being mindful of time, I'm going to jump directly to the next piece of news that is also about how China's satellite industry, commercial satellite industry, is growing very fast. And so basically a massive satellite industry fund is building up in Shenzhen. And the originator of this new satellite industry fund is a Shenzhen-based company called Zhong'an Guotong. And this company, Zhong'an Guotong, was put on maps since 2019 for having a 12 to 15 satellite Earth observation constellation. The company, Zhong'an Guotong, announced about 10-ish days ago that it would set up a satellite industry fund with funding coming from, quoting them here, renowned Chinese investors and industry funds. And among them were some investors that were announced, which were Shenzhen Jintou Fund, the Shenzhen Zhaoyuan Industry Company, as well as the Chongqing Biaogan Investment Holding, which I must admit are companies that I am not familiar with. Zhong'an Guotong is rather a new company. It was founded in 2016 and with few tangible accomplishments so far in the space industry, apart maybe from sending into space a nano satellite focusing on Earth observation called the Zhong'an Guotong 1. And that was in April 2021. Also a piece of news that we covered back in the day. We actually might not have incorporated this piece of news on the Zhong'an Guotong Satellite Fund had the figures not been so impressive, and because definitely the amount of funding is really extraordinary. The fund, apparently, the Zhong'an Guotong Satellite Industry Fund, will be provided with 50 billion RMB. That's more or less 7.7 billion US dollars. And that's a huge amount of money, even for China. And it honestly could undoubtedly provide many satellite constellations with sufficient funding for, the deployment phase of the constellations. Apart from maybe some of those very big broadband ones, that's a lot of financial support that is now out there. It's worth noting that the funding of this satellite industry fund will actually not be made available immediately. It'll be split into 3 phases. We'll have a first phase where the fund will have 5 billion RMB, or about 775 million US dollars. This will be followed by a second phase with 15 billion RMB, or 2.3 billion US dollars, and an ultimate phase with the massive 30 billion RMB, or 4.6 billion US dollars. It will be interesting to see if these 2 last phases with the most funding will actually materialize, and over how many years this timeline of these funding phases will take place. I also want to add here, as sort of a conclusion note here, is that China is no stranger to very big industry thematic funds. And notably, one that comes to mind was this semiconductor fund that was put together in 2014, which housed 140 billion RMB. And so yeah, China is no stranger to these targeted funds, often state-backed. And so yeah, let's see where this Zhong'an Guotong Satellite Industry Fund goes.
And I would point out, admittedly, disclaimer, I am not at all an expert in semiconductors, but my understanding is that the results from that massive fund have been mixed, in the sense that China remains not really at the cutting edge of semiconductor manufacturing, and really not particularly close, as far as I understand, in my very, very, very limited understanding of semiconductors. That being said, back to the Zhong'an Guotong Fund. So a couple of points to add. Interesting that the fund is coming from or based in Shenzhen. So as we discussed on the Dongfang Hour episode 37, just a couple weeks ago, Shenzhen released some incentives and subsidies for satellite manufacturing and related industries in the city. And as we discussed at that time, the city's space sector is historically rather limited, but its broader economy is highly developed, with a lot of talented workers, innovative companies, and a lot of money, including a $1 billion US tower that is owned by APT Mobile Satcom, because why not? It is unclear to what extent Guotong's fund will explicitly be targeting Shenzhen or companies based in Shenzhen, but this is not the first time that Guotong has been involved in the city's space sector. Indeed, we saw in 2020, Guotong was involved with a satellite that was being launched for the 40th birthday of Shenzhen, because what else would you get a city for a birthday? The last point from my side is on the 50 billion RMB figure, which is undeniably huge, but as to Jean's earlier point, we don't really know when or if the second and third phases of this money will be invested. And we've oftentimes seen situations in China, and also in many Western countries, where a company will mention plans for, X billion of investment over the course of some period of time, and then the project does not fully come to fruition, and so the money never gets invested. And the best example in the case of China and space would be CASC initially mentioning 20 billion RMB, about $3 billion US investment into the Hongyan constellation. And as we mentioned earlier today, it seems the Hongyan constellation is likely going to be kind of absorbed into SatNet, and likely that 20 billion RMB was not ultimately spent. And so admittedly, it's a fund rather than a project like Hongyan. And so this Guotong Fund, maybe we will see just an extraordinary amount of investment into space through this fund. Just one last point, I guess, to put it into perspective, and this is off the top of my head, so it could be plus or minus, but I mean, over the last 7 years, the total amount of funding into all Chinese commercial space companies, all of them, is definitely not more than 20 billion RMB, and it might not be more than 15 billion RMB. And so again, to have a single fund that is now 50 billion RMB and focused on space, it's it's not quite Masayoshi Son and SoftBank, but they're getting there. That being said, I can't think of a better note to end on than Masayoshi Son and SoftBank. So, Jean, anything else from your side? Although you have your quiz and your additional information, I guess. So we are not ending on Masayoshi Son and SoftBank. Jean, what do you have for the listeners?
Yeah, I just want to thank our listeners and our followers for supporting the channel, for giving likes, for following the channel. We've passed the 1,000 subscriber mark on YouTube, so that is really unexpected for us. It's really fantastic, and we've seen a bump, notably in number of subscribers over the past 1 or 2 months. So thank you very much for your support, and we will strive to continue to bring good content on China. We're currently overhauling the website. We're working also on a new banner. We launched a newsletter a couple of weeks ago. And this is the sort of initiative that we want to continue to do. And maybe just to finish on a more fun note, I'm going to show up here the banner that we are putting together for the YouTube channel rather than the generic banner that we had previously. And sorters, and as you can see, it's a mosaic of different pictures and images of Chinese space. Actually, all except one. Only one of them is not from Chinese space. So if you have any idea of which picture is not from Chinese space, feel free to drop us a comment in the comment section below. We will announce the answer next week, and we will put the banner up. So again, thank you very much for your support. Thank you for watching, and we will see you next week in a new episode.
Indeed. Thanks a lot, and see you next week.